Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Diablo 3 Build Factory. My name is Phobos, and today's episode will be a comparison episode between Smokescreen and Shadow Power with Gloom. And the basic question we're going to ask ourselves today is which one of these grant more survivability. So without further ado, let's get started. Let's start with Smokescreen, and the rune of choice for Smokescreen will be Lingering Fog, and this means we have 1.5 seconds of invulnerability. And now let's talk about advantages and disadvantages of the skill. If you've seen my first episode on how to survive in Hell and Inferno difficulty, and if you've made your way all the way up to Inferno difficulty, you will know that this skill is really mandatory, at least if you try to stay alive and try to have a certain amount of survivability. And the obvious advantages for the skill are that you can break free of movement impairing effects by activating this skill. This applies to every single movement impairing effect such as freeze, jailer or anything like that. Snare, stun, anything that impairs your movement can be broken with the skill. As well as you can get away from your enemies with the skill really easily. You lose aggro by clicking this skill, and that's always a really nice thing to have, especially if you play with more than one player in the game. Also, a nice advantage for the skill is that you have the option to gain a lot of movement speed when tactical advantage is picked as a passive skill. And a lot of people might underestimate that, but if you have trouble staying away from enemies and keeping them at bay, this skill or this passive skill in addition to Smokescreen can be really beneficial and shouldn't be underestimated if you are struggling with your survivability. And now for the disadvantages. The most obvious disadvantage of Smokescreen is that it is only a short or brief duration of invulnerability. You only have 1.5 seconds with Lingering Fog. Without Lingering Fog you only have 1 second, and that's really brief. If you remember Smokescreen prior to the nerf a few weeks ago, this skill was so much better with 2 or 3 seconds of invulnerability. But that was way too much exploited, so Blizzard decided to nerf this. I elaborated on that topic a few times now, and I guess you guys know about that already. So that's the most obvious disadvantage about Smokescreen now. Another disadvantage about Smokescreen is that it isn't that good for tanking purposes. So due to the short duration of the skill, you can't tank that much of damage, at least in my opinion. You only have 1.5 seconds. That might be enough to take up to 1 or 2 hits, but it isn't a skill where you can just sit tight on your butt and spam the skill. You run out of discipline really fast, and the short duration doesn't grant you that much tankability. It isn't worth it to do that, in my opinion. It's more worth it to break out of movement impairing effects and save your discipline for these cases, especially if you're fighting against champion packs. Another disadvantage of the skill is, I mentioned you can lose aggro by using Smokescreen, that's correct, but you have to get out of sight. That's really important. A lot of people don't take this into account, that monsters remember your last position and will keep running in that direction. So if you want to lose aggro, you have to get out of sight of the monsters. That's really important, that you can do so by cutting corners or by running around a wall or something like that. You have to get out of sight to lose aggro. That's really important. A lot of people always forget about that, but that's something you have to keep in mind. If you want to lose aggro, just try to get out of sight. I can't emphasize that enough. A lot of people think that are bugs or something like that, but that's actually not the case. It's up to you. You have to take responsibility for your actions and for your character. Now let's talk about Shadow Power, and the obvious rune choice for the skill will be Gloom, which reduces the incoming damage by 65%. And just like with Smokescreen, let's talk about advantages and disadvantages of the skill. First off, let's talk about the advantages, and the most obvious advantage about Shadow Power is that you have a really awesome life leech ability while you have the skill activated. You have 20% of the damage dealt returned as life, and that is really awesome, especially in really difficult encounters which have reflect damage, for instance, or where you can't avoid getting damaged. It is really awesome to have this 20% damage dealt returned as life in these cases, because sometimes when you do a lot of crit damage, for instance, just like 300,000 for instance, you get a lot of HP back from these monsters, especially when they have reflect damage, just like I mentioned before. This is so beneficial. So let's say you get hit by an enemy for 30,000 HP. Now let's say you activate Shadow Power and hit the enemy with Impale. And if you are lucky to have critical strikes on your enemy, it is most likely, if your damage is high enough, that each hit returns 10,000 HP to your character. And that's really awesome, because you have to keep in mind, while you are activating Shadow Power, you also take that less damage from enemies. So that's one of the most awesome advantages about the skill. Another great advantage about the skill, due to the life leech ability and the long duration of the skill, this skill is awesome, and I would say the best skill for tanking purposes. It is amazing. 3 seconds, that's quite a lot. You should try the skill in combat yourself and you will realize that 3 seconds is a really long time, especially in Diablo. And life leech ability and less damage? Why do you ask for more? There's nothing better than that. Other than not taking damage at all, that is, of course. And the last advantage, I just mentioned it, you have a really long duration on the skill. 3 seconds is quite long, especially if you compare it to Smokescreen with only 1, or with Lingering Fog 1.5 seconds. So for tanking purposes or for situations where you just can't avoid getting damage, this skill will be your skill of choice. But as always, there are disadvantages, and the disadvantages for this skill are: you always take damage, you can't avoid it. With Smokescreen you can avoid getting damage at all, and that is really nice, especially if you are fighting enemies which are really tough and which will most likely one-shot you if you don't have the gear or the HP in place already. So you can nullify this effect though. If your damage is high enough and you are activating Shadow Power, your returned HP will be high enough to nullify the effect of the incoming damage. That's something you have to keep in mind. Of course you will take damage while Shadow Power is activated, but if your damage is high enough, your life leech ability will make up for that difference. So it depends on how much damage you do to the enemies. Another disadvantage of this skill is Shadow Power is not a oh shit button. And what I mean by that is, it's not for getting the hell out of here purposes. You don't lose aggro by using this skill. You can only tank more damage. It isn't for party play styles, in my opinion. And the thing is, due to the fact that you don't lose aggro, you have to get through combat with this skill only. You can't rely on your teammates, for instance, to take some of the hits if you want to get away from the enemies. Shadow Power won't help you there, and in some cases, if you don't have the gear in place yet, that can be really rough. So I would recommend going for max range at all times if you are picking Shadow Power as your skill of survivability, because just like I mentioned, it is really difficult to get away from enemies with this skill. And another disadvantage is you can't break free of movement impairing effects of Shadow Power, and that is really awful, especially if you're fighting champion packs on Inferno, which most likely always have something that impairs your movement, whether it is snare, stun, jailer, freeze or anything like that. Shadow Power doesn't help you there, so you have to rely on your reflexes and your position and all that good stuff. You can't rely on your skill to save your ass, so Shadow Power isn't designed that way. That's what you have to keep in mind. It is more like take all the damage and kill your enemies as fast as possible. Now for the overall and final verdict. Which skill is better? Which grants more survivability? And my answer is, it depends. It really depends. But in my opinion, Smoke Screen is the better all-rounder. It is better in most circumstances. If you are fighting in an open field and in small corridors and mostly in the overworld, I would say, champion packs, a lot of monsters, doesn't matter. Smokescreen will most likely be better. It really depends also on your gear, if you have enough damage, or if you have enough HP, if you have enough resistances, all that stuff. Smokescreen in most cases will be better, and I guess most people are more familiar with Smokescreen already, because a lot of people start using Smokescreen as soon as Nightmare, and a lot of people don't use Shadow Power because they think, well, it doesn't grant me that much survivability, or Smokescreen is better, I just like it more. I just like not getting damage at all, and they don't have these tanking purposes or tanking attitudes. Most people just go for, yeah, glass cannon builds or something like that, and they think, okay, when I get hit even with Shadow Power and Gloom, I will die. And most likely that's the case, that's correct, but if you have some gear and some resistances and a lot of HP, there are some cases where Shadow Power will flat out beat Smokescreen, and one of these cases are the final fight versus Diablo on Inferno. In my opinion, much more easier if you use Shadow Power, because the fight against Diablo isn't really that difficult. Sometimes Diablo just goes crazy, he will be more aggressive than other times, that's correct. Some people just, well, they already argued that this is somehow weird, and they are correct by saying so, because sometimes Diablo just stands there and does nothing at all, and sometimes he just goes on a frenzy and teleports back and forth behind you, right in front of you, and all that good stuff. And that's really weird at times. But the thing is, most people are struggling as soon as phase 2 when they are fighting their own clones, and we as demon hunters are really fucked because our own clone is insanely strong. Most people just get one-shotted by him. And the thing is, if you're defeating your shadow clone, you will leave one health globe. After that, or if you are not fast enough, Diablo will return and join the fight. And the thing is, one health globe won't be enough to fill up your HP to maximum, most likely, unless you have equipment which grants more health globe HP. So the thing is, if you use Shadow Power and you have the gear to take some of the damage of the clone, it will be awesome, because most of the time when I fight the Shadow clone, I use Shadow Power instantly and then I just nuke him down with Impale, and most of the time that works without a problem. You have 3 seconds per Shadow Power, and the damage dealt by the Shadow clone while I have Gloom activated is nearly nothing, especially if you consider that I get some HP returned from my damage, and sometimes that's up to 15,000 HP. That's enough to nullify the effect, and it's much more awesome than Smokescreen in this case. So if you're struggling with Diablo on Inferno, that's my final advice. And that's all I got for you today. Thank you very much for watching, it's really much appreciated. I hope you enjoyed this episode, or this comparison between Smokescreen and Shadow Power plus Gloom. A lot of people asked me for this topic, and I'm happy that I finally managed to get this episode out, so thank you very much for watching. And if you enjoyed this episode, make sure to press the like button as always, it really helps me out. And if you want to stay up to date, make sure to press the subscribe button. That's also really much appreciated, and I hope you will enjoy my content in the near future as well. So until next time, have a good one, take care and goodbye.